be seated. As we gather this morning, our scripture reading comes from the New Testament book of Romans, a letter that Paul wrote to the church in Rome, chapter 8, verses 12 through 25. But before I read that, I want to remind you of something I mentioned last week, is when we read Paul, there's some language and some terminology that we have to understand because he uses some words in some specialized ways. And so this morning, we'll hear Paul write about spirit and flesh. And when Paul uses the word flesh, he isn't talking necessarily about our bodies, our flesh and blood and bones. When he uses the word flesh, he's talking about a way of life, a way of thinking, a way of acting in the world that is moving away from God, that draws us away from God and from the divine presence. When Paul uses the word spirit, he is talking also about not just a spiritual existence, but a way of living, a way of acting, a way of being and thinking in the world that draws us toward God or into the divine presence. And so he's using these in a little different way than we might be used to or expect. But he's trying to make a contrast between moving toward God or moving away from God. With that in mind, I invite you to hear these words from Romans chapter 8. So then, brothers and sisters, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. For you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received a spirit of adoption. When we cry, Abba, Father, it is that very Spirit bearing witness with our spirits that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if, in fact, we suffer with him so that we may also be glorified with him. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, we too groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For in hope we are saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what is seen? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, I hardly have to name many of the challenges that we face as people today. We can name them in our conversations. We know them as we gather in a park rather than our familiar buildings. We know them in our own lives as we go about just the work of daily living. We are people who are well acquainted with challenges of life. We've seen that here in the recent weeks as there are new orders to wear masks when you're indoors in a public place. And people are wondering, well, do I wear a mask or do I not? And what if I don't want to? And when will that be enforced? We wonder that as parents who have school children, will schools reopen? Will my kids be able to go? And if they go, will they be safe? We face challenges all around us. We see some of those challenges as we read the news and we see protests taking place in the city streets across this nation. And it pains me to say we've already seen the challenge of our political season dawn upon us with attack ads and name-calling surrounding us. And so we know that there are all sorts of challenges that we face. In addition to the regular challenges of making ends meet and going about our daily lives, of coping with loss and pain, of coping with injuries and illnesses. We are people who are well acquainted with the challenges of living. We might say that we are people who understand groaning. And we understand Paul's description that we hear in Romans chapter 8 of this life as being a life where we are groaning not just outwardly with all of the struggles and pressures of daily life, but we're also groaning inwardly, as Paul writes. We perhaps even ask the questions, why must we even groan? Why is there pain and suffering? Why are there divisions and viruses at work in the world? Why is life so difficult and sometimes burdensome? Why indeed, if God has already acted decisively in Jesus Christ? Didn't Jesus come to fix all of this for us anyway? So why do we still groan outwardly and inwardly in our lives? And in chapter 8 of the book of Romans, we hear Paul struggling with these exact questions. Why are there so many instances of pain and suffering and struggle in our present time? Why is there so much groaning in our world? And Paul says, remember that what we experience now is no match for the future glory that awaits us. Paul wants us to remember that this life is not the fullness of all the promises of God. Not yet, anyway. We get to experience them in some small part, but they're not fully completed or fully manifested in our world yet. And so in the meantime, we suffer and we struggle and we grow. But we can make it through these times, Paul tells us, because there is hope. And Paul describes this hope in this passage from Romans chapter 8 as a spirit of adoption. We have been adopted. Now, I know that there are families in our community and around our nation and across the world who have gone through the formal adoption process. And it's a long and arduous process where they say, I'm ready to take a child into my family. And it's a deliberate choice that they make. They say, I will be an adoptive parent. Now, I don't have the experience of adopting a child, but I do have the experience of adopting pets. Now, we have a dog at home. His name is Spud. He was named Spud because when he was adopted, we lived at Pomme de Terre Lake in Missouri. And Pomme de Terre, if you speak French, sounds fancy. It means potato. And so he was named Spud. Now, Spud was a stray dog that lived in the neighborhood around the church that I served in Missouri. And he kind of ran wild and ran loose for a number of weeks. And every time he would come around, I would run him off. I'd yell at him, I'd chase him off, tell him to get lost. He tried to run into the church a couple of times, and I had to block the door and chase him into the neighborhood next to the church to make sure he didn't disturb worship. But more importantly, I had to chase Spud off because I knew that my spouse and my two children were softies, and that if they saw this dog, that dog would become our dog. And so I did everything I could to keep this dog away. Until one evening, there was a snowstorm. It was January. I had a meeting at church, and so I had left early to go shovel the walk. And some point while I was gone, my kid opened our front door, and through the snow came bounding this dog and right into our living room, where he curled up on the couch in the place that I usually sit and refused to move. Now, I got home and I said, and I saw the dog sitting there, and I did what I've been doing for weeks. I said, get out of here, scram, you have to leave, go. You cannot stay here. But the kids worked on me, and they said, no, this is our dog, and we've already named him, and his name is Spud, and he's cold, and he has nowhere to go, and we're going to adopt him. And eventually I relented, and I said, fine, we will adopt Spud as our pet. right? But it taught me that, adoption is a choice. It is a decision, right? I suppose I could have put my foot down and really angered my kids and my spouse and said, no, we're not going to adopt another dog into our house. But I relented and I said, all right, I choose to let Spud come and be a part of our family. Adoption is a choice. If you're adopting a child, you choose to adopt a child. If you are adopting a dog, you choose to adopt that dog. So when we hear Paul say that we live with a spirit of adoption, it's reminding us that we have been adopted by God, not by our own doing, but because God chose to adopt us. It's God's choice. Adoption is an act of grace. It is an act that says, I choose you, and I welcome you in. So when Paul says, remember that you have the spirit of adoption, we know that God has chosen us, that God has adopted us into the family of God. It's a call for us to remember God's grace, which has chosen us, not by our own doing, but by God's desire to be with us. God adopts us. But notice I said us, not me, and not you, but us. For Paul also is challenging us to think about what salvation really looks like and what salvation really means. Paul writes that all creation is longing for redemption, longing for God. Now, within Christianity, we have a tendency sometimes to think about our faith in individualistic terms, right? So we'll ask, how is it with your soul? Or have you been saved? Or do you have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ? These are all wonderful questions that we all should ask ourselves and wrestle with and seek to answer. But Paul reminds us that our faith goes beyond just our personal salvation when he writes that all creation is longing for God. Paul reminds us that we are saved not just by ourselves, but we are saved along with all of creation. Not just that, we're saved with creation and we're not saved from creation. It's not some sort of escape mechanism. Paul wants us to remember that it is not just me alone, but it is we that are part of God's work and grace and plans. And it's not just us as people of faith, but it's us as creation. Everything that God has made will be redeemed, will be renewed, will be recreated. What Paul is painting here is an image of salvation as being expansive and inclusive of all of God's works in the world. And it reminds us that there are no bounds on God's work. There are no bounds on God's redemption. And so Paul is asking us to think even bigger about what God is doing in the world. Paul goes on to describe what God is doing by having given us a spirit of first fruits, the first fruits of the Spirit. Now at home I have a gardener, my youngest son Atticus. He is passionate about gardening. So early on in the pandemic, when we were all locked down, we decided we were going to go plant our gardens, and we went out and we got some raised beds and filled them with dirt, and we put our seeds in. Radish, corn, squash, beans, peas, all sorts of stuff. And I remember the day that we went out and Atticus looked into the garden, and there were the radishes growing. It was early in the season, and the red tops of the radishes were poking up above the soil level. And he was so excited. He said, yeah, now they're ready to pick. And it was the first thing that he'd ever picked out of these gardens. And he picked 3 or 4 radishes, and he pulled them up out of the soil, and he was just amazed. He was floored. He was so excited. He had grown his own food. He didn't eat the radishes. That went to Mom and Dad. But he had grown food, and he was so excited. And so after that day, when he had harvested his first fruits, his first harvest of the season, every day he would go out to the garden expecting more. He knew that something had grown there, and he pulled out food to eat. And so every day he expected there to be more radishes or squash or zucchini or corn or onions. And he was so excited to check every day. And I thought, what a great image of this idea of first fruits. He knew that he had pulled something out, and he knew that the harvest wasn't complete, and the harvest hadn't reached its fullness. And so he went out in anticipation every day. He knew there was more coming. When Paul says we have the first fruits of the Spirit, it's the same for us. It reminds us that we have some taste of God's work in the world already in our lives. We've experienced some aspect of redemption and renewal and recreation. But that's just the first fruits. There's more coming. The fullness of the harvest is yet to be realized. But the first fruits remind us that that harvest is still ahead of us. It gives us hope for God's work to be completed in our lives, in our world, and for all of creation. We have the first fruits of the Spirit. And yet Paul reminds us, even with that, there is still groaning. There is still pain. There is still suffering in the world. And so we wait. And Paul describes this time of groaning as labor pains. Now, I've said a lot of stupid things in my life. One of the stupidest was when I went to my spouse and I said, you know what? I think we should try natural childbirth. It's always easy for the father to say that, right? None of the guys are laughing. They're afraid they're going to get an elbow right in the ribs, I think. Right? So I've witnessed labor, but I've never experienced that pain. But that's exactly what Paul hadn't either, let's be honest. But he's saying that is what this time is like. It's like labor pains. But I think about labor, and for all of the pain that I'm sure that is, it is also pain that brings new life. It brings a life into the world. When Paul says this groaning that we experience now is like labor pains, it's meant to remind us that the pains of today can bring us new life, can bring us new opportunities. We are not yet who God has called us to be. And yet God is pushing us to become something more, to become what God hopes and desires for each and every one of us. And so Paul says, yes, we live in a time of pain and suffering and struggle and difficulty. But remember that in the midst of all of that, you have been saved in hope. Live into that hope. God is calling you into that place of hope. And that hope is available to us, at least in some small portion, here and now, today. Paul says we live in hope of things that we have not seen. Things that we suspect are real, things that we suspect are awaiting us, that full harvest. But we haven't fully seen it. It's kind of like looking for something that you know or you suspect is there, but you can't quite fully see. I don't know if you've been looking to the northwest sky. I always get my directions wrong. About 10 o'clock at night. But up in the night sky is a comet named Neowise that they didn't even know existed back in March. They saw it and they watched it circle around the Earth, and it's making its return back into deep space. And it's bright and it's beautiful. You can see it with the naked eye if you go out and look in the right place. And I was bound and determined to see this comet because it's not coming back into our solar system for another 6,000 years. So you got to see it now or you miss out forever. And so I've been going out every night this week, looking up to the northwest sky, and lo and behold, every night there's a band of clouds coming over Grand Mesa, right across where that comet is in the night sky. I thought, I know it's there, and I hope to see it, and I'm longing to see it, and I can't. But last night, lo and behold, we had a clear sky in the northwest. And so we went out and we could see it with our naked eye, and then we got our binoculars out and we looked up and we saw the comet. And then my son, Walden, has a reflecting telescope. And so we carried that out, and I pointed it up at the northwest sky, and I looked through the eyepiece and I couldn't see it. It's like, I need to see this through the telescope. I long to see. I know it's there, but I can't see it. And so I spent hours. Marguerite finally was like, I'm going to bed. It's 11:30. You stay out here. And I'm like, no, I know it's there. And I swept the view across the night sky, eventually finding it. And it was amazing and glorious. But I thought, our lives of faith are meant to be lived like that, where we go out, we know that God has hope and glory and redemption and renewal and recreation for us. We can't fully see it. We know it's there. And we long so hard to find it, to share it, to experience it. We were hiking a couple of days ago up at Horse Park Ranch. That way. Got to get my... over on Kebler Pass. And we were hiking on the upper end of Dark Canyon Trail. And as we were coming through the aspens, you had this sense that there was just this beautiful vista of the mountain valley awaiting you, but you couldn't really see it because there were too many trees in front of us. And I remember Walden was a little ahead of the trail, and he had that sense. He was like, oh man, there is something beautiful and glorious awaiting around the corner of the trail. And so he took off, moving even faster to try and get to the point where he could see what awaited him. And as he was running up the trail, he had his head kind of craned to the side, trying to see around the corner of the trail, because he was living in hope and anticipation of this marvelous, glorious view. And he just had this hope and this excitement in him. And I thought, this is how we are called to live as people of faith. There is pain, and there is suffering, and there is difficulty. We are groaning. We are going through labor pains. And yet, in the midst of that, we are called to be people who live in hope. Hope that there is something beautiful awaiting us. Knowledge that God has something great in store for us. Knowledge that God is renewing us, redeeming us, and recreating us. And so we have hope. We can't fully see that, but we know it's there for us. Let us live as people of hope. In the name of Christ and by the power of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Well, as we prepare to go forth this morning, I invite you to stand as you are comfortably able to do so, and let us sing verses 1 and 4 of the church's One Foundation.